Morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Census Data Seminar for the Australian Capital Territory. Really excited to have you join us this morning. I'm Duncan Young. I'm the General Manager of the Census Program at the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And I'm joining you today from my home in Tasmania. And so I would like to acknowledge the Palawa people who, for over 40,000 years, have had a continuing culture here in Tasmania, caring for and having an enduring connection with the lands, the seas and the waterways here in Tasmania. I respect their elders past and their elders present and their continuing culture. I'd also like, since it's the ACT Data Seminar, to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are traditional owners of the land on which most of our viewers today, I expect, are joining us from, and acknowledge their elders past and present, but also extend a very warm welcome to members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who might be joining us for the seminar today. You won't have to listen to my voice all the way through the seminar today. I'll also be joined by Caroline Deans, who's the Director of the 2021 Census Dissemination, and definitely more of an authority on census data than I am. But between us, we'll give you a good overview of the census data for the ACT. So we'll start off with a bit of a summary of the 2021 census. We'll talk a little bit about conducting the census during a pandemic. We'll talk about the response rates for the 2021 census and the other key quality measures. We'll provide some of the key data insights, both nationally, but more looking in at the ACT. We'll talk about some of our upcoming releases. There's still more census data to come. We'll talk about how you can access the beautiful data that we're talking to you about today. And then we've got about 30 minutes available to us to ask questions. So we really hope that we get a lot of questions in today. In order to answer questions? No, I'll do the answering. In order to ask for questions, you go to www.polev.com/2021 census DSACT. Now that URL will be hidden on each of the slides on the way through, a bit like a Where's Wally. So you can see that URL as we go through the presentation. And if you go to that URL on your computer or on your phone, you can enter your question in, and then one of my lovely colleagues will ask those questions towards the end of the session. So the census, we get excited about the census data, but the conduct of a census itself is a pretty exciting undertaking. We think it is the largest peacetime operation in Australia whenever it's undertaken, which is every 5 years. A bit like painting the Sydney Harbour Bridge, though, each census takes 7 years. So before you finish the last census, you're already working on the next, and then you're still working on that census whilst you're working on the following census. And as you can see from the slide here, some of the scales of the logistics and operations of a census are quite immense. Our field staff are travelling less than ever before because of our increases in online participation, but they still drove some 10 million kilometres, which is about 26 trips to the moon and back, as a comparison. Also, we're producing less paper in the census, each census, as more people go online, more people self-participate in the census, but we still all scanned some 60 million pages of paper. And if we put all of these pieces of paper on top of each other, we'd be about 3 times the height of Mount Kosciuszko, or 3 separate Mount Kosciuszkos worth of paper. And the printing of paper forms takes a little over 9 months. So imagine that you go to the printer, you set up your settings, you press a print button, then it's some 9 months later, you go away and gestate and create a baby and come back, and then suddenly the print job for a census would be complete. So the scale of a census is huge and immense. But the census in 2021 had some unique charms and some unique challenges brought about by the fact that we're in the second year of COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic was obviously had impacts right across the country during the census period. Some half of Australian citizens were in lockdown at some stage during the census collection period. And in the ACT, where I actually was, I was on census night, but the day after census, we went into a lockdown, and we're in the lockdown for some period after that. So then created some challenges for us in collecting the census, but we had some well-developed plans and for how to undertake the census. And in the end, we think that it's actually contributed to one of the most complete and highest quality censuses we've had in Australia. For example, the census in 2016, there was some 600,000 Australians overseas on census night. In 2021, it was less than 50,000 Australians overseas. So many more Australians were back in the country being counted in the census with their households complete. Similarly, there was less people away from their normal home on census night. There was a reduction of some 14% of people being away from home on census night. And again, that helps create a census data set that has complete households and complete communities together. There are some differences in the data, as you'd expect, due to the pandemic. We do create counts from a census of where people were on census night, as well as their usual residence. And so the counts of people or on census night, you'll see a drop in the number of people staying in hotels. You'll see a drop of people staying in a number of tourist areas. We actually saw an increase in the number of people travelling through Northern Territory and Western Australia, particularly in remote areas and away from where lockdowns were in other parts of the country. You'll see a drop in international visitors. But overall, we're very proud of how we undertook the census during the pandemic. We've managed to produce a very high quality census data set and one which will serve us well for the next 5 years. So how do we measure the quality of a census? Well, we've got a number of measures for quality of a census. Firstly, a response rate. So what proportion of the private dwellings, the occupied private dwellings in Australia, have completed a census form? And as you can see on this slide, 96.1% of Australian private dwellings completed a census form. This is higher than what we saw in 2016 and significantly higher than our target for response rate. So that's fantastic. And in the ACT, big cheers to you guys at 97.2% response rate. And so the ACT has come from third place in response rates in 2011 up to second place in 2016 and has jumped into the lead in 2021 with the highest response rate in the country to the census. We love surveys at the ABS, and so one census and one collection is not enough. So after the census, we go out and we run another survey called the post-enumeration survey or the post-census review. And this is a key quality check of a census. We go out to some 50,000 households across Australia to try and work out and measure how many people in the census are missed and how many people are counted more than once, or how many people are counted in the wrong place. And what you can see here is that the census had a net undercount across Australia of 0.7%. That's the lowest net undercount we've had on record. That's a good thing. And then for the ACT was one of the two territories in the country which actually had a negative net undercount. And this is one of those tricky negative things. It actually means that it was a net overcount in the ACT. And so how does this occur? Well, the key thing that happens is that when we conduct the census, we need to do something about the 2.8% of households in the ACT that didn't respond to the census. And so we do our best job possible to try and create for statistical count for those houses we missed. And in the ACT, we ended up creating a few too many people in those houses. So we've got a very small net overcount. But again, that's a really fantastic number. If you're looking at within 1% of what the actual population is, that's something that we are and should be proud of. The other area that the ACT stands out really is the online response rate. So across Australia, nearly 4 out of every 5 households are now responding online, 78.9%. Fantastic result. But in the ACT, 93.2% responding online. So again, well done ACT, and a big thank you. But it was a lot less paper for us to scan. You didn't have many Mount Kosciuszkos coming out of Canberra. And also the online form gives us some really high quality data. But we'll start sharing with you now. So it's my privilege to sort of start with sort of a bit of a national kind of picture of Australia. So firstly, how has Australia's population changed over the last 5 years? So the census count was 25,422,788 people. So clearly the first time an Australian census has counted over 25 million people. And what this chart here shows you is how has the population count increased in the census between 2016 and 2021. And so you can see that ACT was the fastest growing territory in the country with a 14.4% growth since 2016. Excuse me, the fastest growing territory for the second time in a row. Victoria, second fastest at 9.7%, again, second fastest twice in a row. And at the other end of the spectrum, the best kept secrets in Australia, VNT were 1.6% growth and South Australia were 6.3% growth. So let's dig into that a little bit more for the ACT. So as I said, 14.4% growth. That followed 11.2% growth in 2016 and a 10.2% growth in 2011. So it's been growing quickly in the ACT. The population over the last 5 years for the whole of Australia has just over doubled. But in the ACT, it has more than tripled in the last 50 years. One of the great things that the census does is it gives you not only a count of the population of a country, but also a count of the dwellings in the country. And so what this chart shows is the growth in population on the left and growth in dwellings on the right. And it's showing both the ACT, but also some of the surrounding areas as around the ACT, which obviously a number of people from those areas come into the ACT regularly, into Canberra regularly, commuting for work. And so the biggest areas of growth in the ACT was this is divided into statistical area 3s. And so the statistical area 3 of Molonglo has grown by some 150% to 11,500 people in the last 5 years. So that's mainly the big growth in Wright and Coombs, the suburbs on the west side of Canberra. And Gungahlin continues to grow strongly. It's grown 23.3%. There's now some 88,000 people in Gungahlin. And some of the new suburbs like Bonner has 7,500 people alone. Casey has 6,500 people. So some of these suburbs right out on the northern edge have grown significantly, not only in the last 5 years, but in the last 10 years. What you can see slightly between the left and the right there is that there's some darker colours on the left and the right. So the population growth has outstripped the dwelling growth in the ACT. So that, it can be seen there, and has seen a drop in the number of unoccupied homes in Canberra, as well as a maintenance of the size of homes in the ACT. Looking at Molonglo and Gungahlin a little bit more, so over populations of Molonglo and Gungahlin are slightly different to the rest of the ACT. So about 40% of the population of those two areas are born overseas, compared to only about 30% overall across the rest of Canberra. In Gungahlin, we see a large defence population. So 6% of the population of Gungahlin are either currently serving or have previously served in the Defence Forces. And as I mentioned, the level of unoccupied homes is quite low. In Gungahlin, it's only 4.5% compared to 10% across the rest of the country. There has been growth in populations in Yass, Queanbeyan and Goulburn. In terms of population, we've got Queanbeyan a growth rate of greater than 10%. Okay, I'll pause there and hand across to Caroline to get into a little bit more detail about our population. We're just not getting your audio at the moment, Caroline.
How's that now? Sorry about that, technology issues.
Fantastic.
Okay, let's start again. So good morning, everyone. My name's Caroline. I'm the Director of the Census Dissemination Team, and I'm joining you today from Canberra, so the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I will also extend my respect to elders past, present and emerging. Let me get into a little bit more of that population story. So we're starting with a population pyramid, demographers' best friend, I would say. They always like to use a pop pyramid. And for those who aren't that familiar with the pop pyramid, let me describe to you what we're seeing. I've got on the screen the 2001 pyramid, and that's showing on the left there males and on the right females, and each one of those bars represents a 5-year age cohort going up to 85 plus, and that shows you what proportion of the general of the population is in that age cohort. And you can see it's actually fairly even. This is a very odd looking pyramid. It's not very pyramided shape. You can see pretty much from the age 54 down, right down to about 20 or so, quite even on both the males and the females. But if I do look at the largest group in 2021 for the males, on the left there, it's the ages 15 to 19 and 20 to 24. And in the females, it's also that 20 to 24, but it's also equally a little bit older with the 35 to 39 and the 40 to 44. But as you can see, quite an even spread of the population all the way through the adult years up to about the age of 55. I'm now going to overlay the 2021 data and look at how that has shifted. So I'll talk you through what we are seeing here. We're seeing that now that the most common age groups for males is a little bit older than it was 20 years ago in 2001. It's now between 25 and 39. So those three cohorts between the ages of 25 and 39 are the largest group of males in the Canberran or the ACT population. And if I look at females, it's again that same age group all the way from 25 through to 39. And you can see when we compare the teal-coloured bars there with the orange-coloured bars where there have been changes. And I'll draw your attention in particular to teenagers. So in between the ages of 10 and 19, teenagers now make up a smaller proportion of the population in the ACT. And likewise, people in their 40s through to their early 50s represent a smaller proportion of that total population. And where we've seen the growth is in the population's age 60 and above, and particularly for females there on the right, you can see that quite clearly. And when we look at that age group, say the 60 to 75 year age group, that now represents 12.6% of the ACT population, but 20 years ago it was only 8%. So quite a bit of change. Duncan mentioned the growth in the population that we've seen, but also the change in that profile is very interesting. I'll also mention the median age. The median age for the ACT in 2021 was 35, which is lower than the Australian average of 38, and it's quite varied throughout the territory. Tuggeranong has the oldest median age, and that's the same as the Australian average of 38. Belconnen, a little bit younger and representing the ACT average of 35. Out to Gungahlin and Molonglo, which we've mentioned already, and Gungahlin got a median age of 32 and Molonglo 31. So quite a bit of variety across the ACT population. Now you might have noticed that I'm talking about male and female when I'm talking about sex on that age pyramid. And you may recall when you completed the census last year and you answered the sex question that you had a third response option, and that was the response option of non-binary sex. For all our general data releases, we're releasing data as male and female, and what we'll be doing is releasing a special analytical article in a few months' time that looks into people who have responded with that option of non-binary sex. Now, the reason we are doing that is to collect gender identity or non-binary gender or transgender, you actually need to ask a question on gender, which we didn't do in the census. So while we have captured some responses to a third response option, it's not actually representative of a gender identity question. And so we're being very careful about how we release that data to make sure that it's not misinterpreted. And so that's why whenever you're playing around with the census data, you'll see it's all available to you as male and female, except for that article that I mentioned that will be coming out in a few months' time. Moving on now to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of the ACT. And first, I'll just present a summary slide of what's happened in the last 10 years. So just like we have seen really large growth in the population of the ACT, we're seeing even larger growth in the population of people who've responded as having an Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander origin. So in the 2021 census, that's now just short of 9,000 people identified that way, a growth of 37.5% on the previous census. And the previous census was also a growth of 25.5% on the one before that. So if we go back 10 years, there are about 5,184 people, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander identification, representing 1.5% of the ACT population, growing to nearly 9,000 and now representing 2% of the ACT population. At an Australia level, the growth rate has been 25% as well, to a total number of just over 800,000 people now identifying as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander across Australia. And what I've got on the screen there is just showing you what the population growth has been over time of the different states. And you can see there, Victoria and ACT have both had that really high level of growth, although the numbers are still relatively small. And in terms of numbers of people who identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, the dominant states for those populations continue to be New South Wales with about 278,000 and Queensland with just under 240,000. Moving on to measures of cultural diversity. And in the census, we ask quite a number of questions that allows us to explore the cultural diversity of our community. So we ask about where you're born, languages that you speak at home, where your parents were born. We also ask about religious affiliation, ancestry, how well you speak English. So quite a range of questions to really tell a full story of the cultural diversity of our communities. And I'm only going to touch on some of those measures today in reference to the ACT. So let's start by talking about an overall measure of diversity, which is what we would describe as first generation, second generation, and third generation. And so the ACT is diverse. If I explain these definitions here, down in the bottom right, the first generation people, 23.4% of people in the ACT were themselves born overseas. And then extending that with the second generation, the people who had parents who were born overseas. And you can see that's making up well over half of the population of ACT were either themselves born overseas or had parents who were born overseas. And then the remainder there, 46.7, were neither born overseas or had parents born overseas, the remainder there. And that's a lower rate than the Australian average. The Australian average has got about 48% of people who are third or more generation Australian. And the countries of birth where people come from. Really interesting patterns here in the ACT, which are a little bit different to what we see when we look at Australia. So you can see there the most common country of birth was Australia, but that's only 2/3 of the population of the ACT are born in Australia. And then there are a number of other countries that make up the remainder of people who were born other than in Australia. The highest number of people born overseas were actually born in India, and that has been a strong growth since the previous census. So we're now seeing over 17,000 people, or 3.8% of the ACT population born in India, followed by England, which used to be in the second spot there, and then followed by China, and you see Nepal, New Zealand, and the Philippines. And where this differs from Australia is Nepal. Nepal has come in there as the 5th country of birth of all people in the ACT, and has in fact increased from only 760 people in 2016 up there. You can now see 5,500 people coming from Nepal and now living in the ACT. And where do we see these people? So showing you another map, again by the statistical area 3, showing you the ACT and just the surrounding areas. So the dark colours there are representing regions where there are a higher proportion of people who were born overseas, and the highest rate is actually in Molonglo. That's 41% of people living in Molonglo were born overseas. And if I look at the countries of birth, dominated by India, 10.2% of people in Molonglo are in fact born in India, followed by the other ones that were making up our top 5, China, Nepal, Philippines, and England. The other big SA3 that you can see there with a high proportion of people born overseas is Gungalan, again dominated by India, China, England, Nepal, and Pakistan comes into that as well. And then the other 2 regions with higher rates are Belconnen and Tuggeranong. So that's showing a little bit of the diversity that you see in where people are spread across the ACT and their countries of birth. This next chart shows what year people arrived in Australia. So these are people who are currently living in the ACT and the year they first arrived in Australia from overseas. And we've colour coded this in a quite obvious way, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, just so you can really quite clearly see the shifts in that time. So if I go back to 2016, and you're seeing there was about 5,500 people came in, going up over 6,000 the next couple of years, and then nearly 6,000 in 2019.
The two.
Oh, sorry, we seemed to have a little bit of interference in the background there. I'll keep going. I don't think that was me. And then when we get into that year 2020, you can see those numbers have dropped right off. And in 2020, there was 2,600 people who arrived from overseas and now living in the ACT. And we haven't looked at that by month, but presumably quite a number of those were in the first part of the year when there wasn't a pandemic and our borders were still open. And then that final bar there is 2021 until the time of the census, which was the 10th of August 2021. So that's not representing a full year, but you can see very low numbers of people actually arriving in the ACT last year up to the time of the census. And we did see across Australia the rates came down, or the numbers came down. And when I look at ACT as a proportion of all arrivals into Australia, it kind of varies quite a bit over the periods we've got here. Tends to be around 2.5%, and even during the pandemic years has stayed around that 2%. So hasn't really seen an increase, but is showing that same proportion of the total reduced numbers that we're seeing in Australia. And I've got another measure here of the diversity of the community. And here we're looking back 30 years in time just to show how the population has changed. So if I look back to 1991, back then 84% of the population spoke only English at home. So there are only about 15% that used a language other than English at home. And of those who did use a language other than English at home, you can see there all the European languages there: Italian, Croatian, Greek, German, Spanish. Fast forward to 2021, and we now see that there are 71% of people who only use English at home. So there's nearly 30% who are now using a language other than English at home. And the makeup of those languages has shifted entirely to all Asian-based languages, with Mandarin taking out the top spot there, but also seeing in a couple of the Indian languages coming in and Nepali coming in as well, reflecting that change in population over the last several years into the ACT. And finally, I'm going to just talk about religious affiliation and how that has changed over time. You might have seen some reporting in the media. It's always an interesting story that gets picked up about whether Australia is losing our religion. And what I've got here first is the Australia chart, just to show you how we have seen a change over the last 50 years in how people have reported their religious affiliation. And here it's at the very broadest level of all the Christian denominations combined in that dark orange line. And you can see that going from 85% all the way down to just over 40%. And then the no religion, being the dark green, has gone from under 10% to nearly 40%, and they're not quite meeting, but they're coming close. And then along the bottom there, going from virtually nothing, a very low number indeed, up to about 10% is all the other religions, the non-Christian religions that people have reported. And going into the ACT, we've broken it down a little bit further here. I've still got that dark green bar is still the no religion. And in the ACT, that is higher than is reported across Australia. So in the ACT, that's 44.2% compared to 38.9% for Australia. And that's up from 15.9% way back in 1986. So just that steady growth in people who've reported no religious affiliation. And in fact, I should just say no religious affiliation also includes those who report secular or other spiritual beliefs. So coming up to close to half the population of the ACT is now reporting that. And then in the dark orange are the Catholic denomination. And that's decreased from around 30% to now under 20%. Yellow is Anglican, also showing that decrease. And that peach colour there is other forms of Christian, including people who answer just Christian. So they don't identify with a particular denomination, but they respond just as Christian. So you can see all those Christian denominations are decreasing. And down the bottom of the chart again, have separated out the various other religions that people have reported. And the real growth there is in Hinduism. That dark blue line at 4.5% is Hinduism, reflecting where people are coming from into the ACT. And then we also see in the orange, Islam is a little bit lower at 3.2%. And Buddhism has had a more stable path over the last 20 years or so. And excuse me, and I'm now going to pass back to Duncan to talk about a couple of the new questions that we had on the census.
Thanks, Caroline. The thing that's more exciting than new census data is new census data on new census questions. And for the first time since 2006, we had the opportunity to add 2 new topics to the census in 2021. So really exciting to have this data now, and it's certainly an area of significant interest. So one of the 2 new questions or 2 new topics on the census was long-term health conditions. Got a little bit of a snippet of the census form here to give you a bit of a look at that question. So there was a lot of interest and a lot of submissions to the ABS when we went out to ask about our census topics. suggesting that the importance and value of understanding long-term health conditions across Australian society. And that led to some testing by the ABS and recommendations to government, and government made the decision to include this topic. The topic asked for people to report any of 10 select health conditions, long-term health conditions, and these were come about through stakeholder consultation based on how common they were, whether there was other data available, and what data was most needed to inform services, policy, and research. The ABS collects a lot of data on health through our other survey program, and what's really great about our survey program is it allows you to go a lot more in depth on understanding individual conditions and exploring those individual conditions with a trained qualified interviewer out there with the Australian public. But what's amazing about the census is that it gives us a chance to break down our understanding of health conditions in small population groups, small areas, and look across the whole population as of Australia. So it's really exciting to have this data. But because there are differences in when you collect this data from a survey or a census, we have released an article on our website, which you can find under the census part of the ABS, explaining the differences between the health data and the census and the health data that you might see out of our surveys. Whilst there's only one question here on the census, from this one question, we've generated over 30 different variables of data. So obviously variables for each of the different health conditions, but also variables about comorbidities or the people who have multiple health conditions, for example, asthma and lung conditions. So people who have both those health conditions, it's really important to understand. And also, but the number of people that have conditions. But enough preamble, let's get into the fun data. So 28% of ACT usual residents reported having one of the long-term health conditions on the census form. So this is about 127,000 people in the ACT. The majority of the 127,000 had only one health condition, as you can see there, 90,000. But you can also see there that over 11,000 people in the ACT have 3 or more health conditions. And interestingly, the number of people in the ACT with a long-term health condition reported on the census is slightly higher than the Australian population. So it's 27.7% across Australia, 28.1% in the ACT. Let's dig into this a little bit further. So here, these worms going across this graph are showing 5 of the health conditions broken down by different age groups. So let's start with the orange worm there, but that's the worm representing arthritis. And what you can see there is that clearly, as people have got older, they're more likely to have a health condition of arthritis. So once you're in the 100 years and over category, 45% and have had a nurse or a GP tell them that they've got arthritis as a long-term health condition. And this is one of the powers of a census. Our surveys could never look at groups as small as 100 years and over or 90 to 99 years, but census has got a big enough representation in those groups. And so arthritis in the ACT is slightly higher than for the rest of the country and higher for every age group from 40 plus us in the ACT versus the rest of the country. Now, asthma is the yellow line. It's more of a consistent kind of line. And so most age groups have about the same prevalence of asthma. And so it's one of the highest ones, or it's the highest condition for people in the 0 to 9 year age group. And it is higher in the ACT across all age groups than the rest of Australia, and 9% overall versus 8% across Australia. Diabetes in green, again, increases a bit with age, but a peak a little bit earlier than the arthritis. So there is some reporting in 30s and 40s, but interestingly here in the ACT, we see lower lower reporting of diabetes than the national average through these middle age groups where we see for peaks. Heart disease is sort of similar, the purple there with a peak later in life, similar to arthritis, but not as prevalent, not as high a percentage. And overall, again, like diabetes, heart disease is a lower proportion of people in the ACT compared to the rest of the country. And then the final one of the 5 worms here is the mental health condition worm, the blue one. And so the peak here is in the 20 to 29 year age group. And but it's also quite high in teenage years. And for mental health conditions is one which is definitely a bit of a difference between the ACT and the rest of the country, with higher reporting across all age groups. Been showing a little bit more that the power of health conditions question in the census allows you to sort of look in at geographic levels. And so this picture's representing, again, those statistical area threes of the ACT and the surrounding areas, and the proportion, the darker colour means a higher proportion of people with a mental health condition, and the lighter colours are a lower percentage of mental health conditions. In fact, it's reasonably even across the ACT, but it is slightly higher in North Canberra with 11.8%, 10.9% in Belconnen, and the lowest rate is in Canberra East. But Canberra East, and there's only 7.1%, but Canberra East is a very unpopulated area. There's only about 2,000 people across Canberra East with the airport and through that kind of area in the ACT. The other new topic in the census was a question on service in the Australian Defence Force. So we asked all Australians whether or not they were currently serving in the Australian Defence Force for regular service or the reserves, or whether they had former been part of it, the service. And it's that former population which is of particular interest to make sure that the service delivery across the nation is really reaching our former service men and women. So what we saw in the ACT was that 2% of the ACT population, aged 15 years and over, have served in the Australian Defence Force, made up of 8,000 which are currently serving and some 14,000 that have previously served. In both the current serving and the previously served, there is a big bias towards male over female. So some 25% of the currently serving Defence Force people were women compared to 75% male. It's slightly more even in the ACT though than across the rest of the country. Within the ACT, Western Creek have the highest proportion of previously served, with some 5% of the population, closely followed by Tuggeranong. And Canberra East, again, with that small population, they actually have a highest percentage of a currently serving population. Moving into households and families. So the census breaks down, classifies households in family households, lone person households, and group households, so groups of people living together unrelated. Now, so this is a picture of the ACT, so some 70% of households are family households, some 26% are lone households, and some 5% are group households. Now, how does ACT compare to the rest of the country? Well, it has actually the highest percentage of group households in the country. So whilst 5% looks pretty small in that pie chart there, it compares to only 4% across the rest of the country. Slightly more lone person households, 25.8 versus 25.6 across the rest of the country, and slightly less family households as well. And of the family households, most of the family households are family households of only 2 people. So some 50,000 of the households have only 2 people living in them. 3 or 4 people all living in about 25,000 households, and only 15,000 households with 5 or more people. And so And then looking just at that 65% of households that are family households, this is the breakup of those. So as I mentioned, a lot of the households only have two people. A number of those would be couples with no children, so that 40% in the middle. Important to remember here that couples with no children doesn't mean that they haven't had children. It just means that there are no children living with them at census time. So they could be empty nesters, they could be young couples that haven't had children yet, or they could be couples that haven't had children and throughout their life. For ACT have the highest growth rate of families out of all states, increasing by 17.4% since the last census. But the average number of people per household is stayed at 2.5, the same as in 2016. Interestingly, in the ACT, the number of lone parent families has dropped and is lower than the national average. So it was reduced from about 16% in 2001 down to 13.9% now, and compares to a national average of 15.9%. And so most of the things with families and households, they're pretty slow changing and slow moving over time, but you can sort of see the trends as you look over a longer period of time. But one area that has, in the family classification, that's changed quite quickly is the number of same-sex couples counted in the census. And so important to remember here that the census only counts families and relationships within a household. So it's not a count of all same-sex couples or to account of all marriages in the country, because people could be living apart, but it counts people which are living together at census time. So this chart shows that the count of, in the orange, the number of de facto same-sex couples in the country, and the number of, in teal, the number of people, same-sex couples in registered marriages in the country. Unsurprisingly, this sort of shape overall by state sort of mirrors the relative size of the populations. New South Wales is the largest state, has the largest number of same-sex couples. The ACT, whilst it's growing fast, isn't a particularly large population overall, and has their 2,000 same-sex couples, or about 2.5% of all of the same-sex couples in the country. Probably more interestingly, though, is to look at the count of same-sex couples in the ACT over time. So this is over the last 6 censuses. In 2021, you can see that, as I said, there's about 2,000 same-sex couples in the ACT, and this has grown by 68% there since 2016. So a significant growth, 63% growth there since 2016. So really significant growth between the last 2 censuses, slightly lower than the 68% growth across Australia, despite the fact that ACT is growing quite quickly. And as you can see here, since 1996, the number of same-sex couples counted in the ACT has grown significantly. Time to hand back to Caroline.
Thank you, Duncan, and I'm now going to finish off our data presentation talking about the dwellings and some dwelling-related variables. We have got quite a number of questions coming through, but as a reminder, if you've got any questions that you'd like us to answer, please send them through to that POEV address. So let's talk about dwellings in the ACT. And first of all, the tenure type, or how we own the dwellings that we live in. And these are the private dwellings that we live in. We're not talking about here about people who were in a hotel or in another form of communal type accommodation, but people who are in private dwellings. And the dominant tenure type in the ACT is owned with a mortgage. That's 40%, 40.2% of all dwellings in the ACT are people who own it with a mortgage. And that's increased quite a bit since the last census in 2016. It was only 38% in 2016, jumped up to 40.2%. And the figure for owned outright, the 26.6%, hasn't really changed over the last 5 years. So where the switch has been is there's been a decrease in people who are renting from about 32% and an increase in people who are owning with a mortgage. And these figures are quite a different pattern to what we see nationally, where owned with a mortgage is the dominant tenure type across all Australian households, but at a lower rate of 36%. And we see owned outright nationally is about 31%, and rented is pretty much the same as it is in the ACT. Focusing in a bit on the newest area that we've been talking about, Molonglo, and I think that's because we're seeing such a growth in that region. It's helping to explain why we've got the driver up of the owned with a mortgage. So in that region, only 7.7% of dwellings are owned outright. Not surprising for such a new area. 65% are owned with a mortgage and only 26% rented. So what I'm showing you there is the ACT figures, but if you want to drill into any more detail, and I'll tell you in a minute how to do that, you can see we can get this data for all levels of geography that you may be interested in. So how has our tenure type changed over time? Here we're presenting it as the number of dwellings rather than the proportions that I had on the previous slide. And you can see that shape is quite similar when we're looking at the number of dwellings between 2016 and 2021. Owned outright is the dark orange bar, and that's increased from about 30,000 in 1996 up to about 45,000 in 2021. And the owned with a mortgage has increased from about 36,000 up to just short of 70,000. Going to touch on unoccupied dwellings, and you may have seen a bit of coverage in the media about unoccupied dwellings, because again we saw in Australia that there are about 1 million dwellings unoccupied on census night, and the ACT's share of that was about 175,000. And so that what we're showing here is the proportion. I've got in orange the Australia figure and in teal the ACT figure. So in Australia, about 10.1% of dwellings were unoccupied on census night, and in the ACT it was quite a bit lower at 6.4%, and they're both decreases on the figures from 5 years ago. But let me just explain what unoccupied dwellings are. They're dwellings that were unoccupied on census night, which might mean that they are actually dwellings that are available for let, but they could be dwellings where people maybe have two dwellings. For example, they might have their dwelling in Canberra, but maybe they were down the coast or they were living somewhere else on census night. So their dwelling in Canberra may have been unoccupied on census night. It also includes newly completed dwellings that haven't quite been moved into yet. They're ready to be moved into, but they haven't been moved into. And also dwellings that are able to be lived in, but haven't yet been demolished yet. So there are quite a few different reasons why dwellings may be unoccupied on census night, not necessarily saying that in Canberra, in the ACT, there are 175,000 dwellings sitting vacant all the time, but just on census night last year, there were about 175,000. The dwelling structure has changed over time in the ACT as well, and I think anyone who's travelled around the various suburbs of Canberra has seen this for themselves. And looking over the last 20 years, separate house there is the dark orange colour. Back in 2001, 3/4 of all dwellings in the ACT were separate houses, and when we go forward to 2021, only 61% are now separate houses. So quite a decrease in the number of people living in separate houses. And what we see is an increase in the people who are living in semi-detached or townhouses. Not that great an increase, from 13.3% to 17.4%. The really big increase is what you can see there in the dark teal colour. Back in 2001, there's only 1.4% of dwellings in the ACT were flats or apartments in a 4 or more story block, and that's increased significantly to 12.4% in 2021. And I'm calling in today from Belconnen. I can look around and see evidence of that out the window. The final data slide that I'm going to talk to is about income and housing costs. Just one slide, pulling it all together for you. So what we've got here is our median total personal income, and this is just for the ACT. And you can see from 2016 to 2021, there's been an increase of just over 20% in median personal income. That's about more than twice the rate of inflation. And that's at a level much higher than the Australian median. That 1,203 compares to 805 Australia-wide. When we now look at it for household income, so all the people within a household who are earning an income, just add those together. That has also increased by quite an amount to now being 2,373 in 2021. Again, much higher than the Australian median total household income. Rent has also increased quite a bit, gone up by 18.4% to $450 a week as the median rent. Again, much higher than the Australian median. In Australia, we see $375 is the median weekly rent. And then finally, we've got there the median mortgage repayments. This time is expressed in a monthly figure. And you can see not much change actually in the dollar payments made on mortgages, still just over $2,000, but much higher than Australia, which is about $1,863 is the median mortgage repayment monthly in Australia. Now, I will just give a word of caution about using data on mortgage repayments. This is in the census. People report how much they pay for their house, whether it's a rent or their mortgage. And for people who are paying off a mortgage, they may actually be paying off more than their minimum repayment. They may be taking advantage of the lower interest rates we have seen in recent years. So that reported amount that they pay off doesn't necessarily represent the minimum amount that they need to pay off. So worth bearing that in mind if you're ever looking at data on mortgages. So that's all the data we're going to talk about. I'll now tell you where you can find that data for yourself before we turn to some questions. So we have today gone through a lot of data from quite a number of topics that you can see in that left column there. That was all the data that we released in our first release at the end of June. And we haven't covered all of it, but we've touched on quite a bit of it. We still have a lot more data to come. So in October, we're going to release more information on labour force, including what occupation people work in or what industry, their method of travel to work. And given the COVID situation and the lockdown restrictions that we were seeing at the time, what will we see with how many people are working from home and how people actually got to work and how that has changed. So that will all be coming out in our next data release. Another really important item that we'll see coming out in October is what we call internal migration, and that's where people have lived 1 year ago and 5 years ago. So we can see that in Canberra, in the ACT, so many people, the population has grown by quite a bit. Where did they come from? We'll be able to answer that in October. And then we go ahead to next year, early to mid-2023, we release some of the data. It's a little bit more complex to produce. So we have an index called the Socioeconomic Index for Areas, CEFA, Measures of Advantage and Disadvantage. That will be released in early to mid-2023. We also have estimates of homelessness, and that's not just homelessness as in rough sleeping, but all forms of homelessness that people are experiencing, from living in couch surfing to refuges and so on. And a couple of other things there will be coming out in third release. So how do you get to the data? It's all on our website. We've got so much data available for you on the website. And you can look, what I've got here is some screenshots, and you go to Census and find census data. And you can choose to either search census data by topic, and we've got topics there like cultural diversity, which I spoke about. If you click on that tab, you'll see lots of data, summaries of cultural diversity and data cubes there that talk about cultural diversity, or you might be interested in housing or some of the families data that Duncan spoke about. So that's searching for it by topic. But what you might also be interested in is data for your local area. So we've really spoken about the ACT today. We've talked about Australia comparisons, but you might be interested in your particular suburb, and we've drawn out a few of those as we've spoken. But if you're interested in your suburb or your postcode or your electoral district, your local government area, any number of geographies, you can find that in our search census data by area. And you just type in the geography you're interested in, and you can get things called quick stats or community profiles that will give you an excellent profile of your area. I will mention Census Table Builder because I expect a number of you are users of Census Table Builder, and we haven't released that as yet with census data. You can still access Census Table Builder for 2016 data, but we're still working on getting it out for the 2021 data. And we've got in our Table Builder part of the website, we are posting updates of when that will be available. We haven't got a date yet, but we're really working very hard to get that available for you by the time we release second data. So keep an eye on the Table Builder update page of the website if you are interested in looking at Table Builder when that gets released. And the final thing that's on our website that you might be interested in is our census dictionary. This is a really fantastic tool that lists all the variables that are released from the census and gives you more information about them so you can use them with confidence. So we defined what the variable is. We describe the scope of the variable. So some items like, say, income, for example, is only asked of people over 15 years of age. So that the scope is defined. The categories that they're released in, how are the variables created, and how it's changed over time, just to make sure that when you're using data with time series comparison, that you're comparing like with like. The other thing that we mentioned in our data use considerations for each variable is the item non-response rate. So how many people didn't answer that particular item, and how has that changed since the last census. So the Census Dictionary is a really great place to find more information about all the variables in the census. And when you're in any of our other products, you can link through to those variables. So if you're in a community profile or you're in a quick stats, for example, you can click through and just find out more so that you know what variables you're talking about and how you should be using that. So now I'm going to hand over to Aoife, who is going to be taking us through questions, and I'm just going to put that Poll EV address on the screen again.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Duncan, for the wonderful presentations. We'll now move to the Q&A session for the next 20 or 30 minutes. We've got lots of questions coming in through Poll EV, so keep them coming, and we'll get through as many as we can today. Any that we don't get through, that we don't get to answer live, you're welcome to email them after the session to client.services@abs.gov.au. So first question today, on the long-term health conditions topic. So why do you think the mental health problems rising in Canberra? Is it due to the cost of living, loneliness, or the pandemic?
Well,
Duncan?
Thanks, Aoife. Thank you for that question. It's a really great question, sort of a sad question, but a great question. I guess first, a bit of a clarification. Because this is the first time we've collected this data on the census, we don't have a measure of whether or not it's increasing or decreasing or changing. We just have a snapshot of mental health conditions at the moment. What I did mention earlier was that there's a slightly higher percentage of people in the ACT have reported having a mental health condition compared to the rest of the country. Some of that could be reflected by the fact that the ACT population is slightly younger than the rest of the population, and as we saw in the data, there is a higher prevalence or a higher likelihood that people have a reported long-term health condition in that at sort of teenage and 20s, 30s kind of age range. So that would contribute a little bit to the fact that the ACT has higher. Could also be reflected by access to services in the ACT, the fact that people can get a diagnosis and can go and get support and have a society which is supporting that. But it's one of those fantastic questions that I hope that the census data will help others, the health professionals, the academics, the researchers, the policy advisors, really try and unpack and get more information for. So imagine just in a couple of months' time when we get second release data out and we could look at health conditions alongside occupations and industries, or even the data now, you can look at health conditions alongside dwelling status, household income versus mortgage repayments. So a lot of that analysis I'm hoping that the census can really help with, but we don't have yet full answers to that at this stage.
Thanks very much, Duncan. Next question. It's about accessing census data via ABS's APIs. The person who sent the question said they haven't yet used the APIs, but does the API allow advanced interrogation, such as filtering and cross-referencing, like Table Builder does? And then an additional comment, that is, should I do a crash course in the API or wait for Table Builder? Caroline, maybe?
I can probably, I'll take that one to start with. So APIs are a tool that are really useful for machine-to-machine transfer of data. The form that you get the data from in an API is, yes, it can be read by a person, but it's easier if you're sucking it into an app or something like that. So APIs are presentations of aggregate data, but packaged in a more convenient way for that machine-to-machine transfer. So it doesn't allow the detailed filtering and combining of tables. It's quite a different tool to what you can get in Table Builder. So I'd say if you're wanting to slice and dice the data according to your own needs, then probably best to wait for Table Builder. Or if you want something really soon, then you can send through, we've got the address on the screen, the client services address, if you had a query that you wanted answered in the shorter term, a consultancy then you could address that to the client services and could get onto it sooner.
Thank you, Caroline. Next question. Duncan, you mentioned the population of the current and former serving defence members in the ACT is 2%, but I understood it to be much higher at 5.98% of the ACT aged 15 plus population. For example, 22,226 out of 371,559 ACT residents aged 15 plus.
Thanks, Aoife. Again, great question. Canberra people are switched on listening to the details. My mistake, like when I reported that, the 2% refers to the currently serving population of Canberra, so not for whole current and former serving in population. So and 2.2% and of a current of the population of ACT serving is quite notable because it's only about 0.4% across the country. So obviously there's quite a large defence population in Canberra, but when you include the previously served, there's another 3.8% in the previously served. So gold star for that person with that question.
Thanks, Duncan. Next question. With the high population growth in the ACT and interstate migration, where are these people coming from?
That's probably one I can answer, say you're best to wait. If you really want to know where people lived 1 year ago and 5 years ago, that data will all be available from the second release of census data, which will be coming out in October.
Thanks, Caroline. Next question. Regarding the ACT's changing age distribution, why do you suppose there was a decline in the proportion of teenagers over the past 20 years?
So let me try and, so the proportion of teenagers have decreased. And I think without looking at the numbers, I think we would say that's just because of the increase in the rest of the population. So we're not necessarily seeing fewer teenagers, just a smaller proportion of teenagers because we've seen such a growth in all those other age cohorts.
Excellent. You noted that the vacant properties on census night could represent people who were staying elsewhere that night, in addition to properties which had not been moved into yet. Has any analysis been done on the fact that this will have been less likely than in previous years due to the ACT being in a lockdown at this time?
Yes, we did see when we're looking at the unoccupied dwellings, we did see that there were fewer unoccupied dwellings in the ACT compared to 2016 and in a number of other jurisdictions. And the other data that Duncan mentioned at the start was the number of people away from home. And we also saw that had decreased quite a bit. So we found that more people were actually at home on census night and less likely to be travelling for business or for leisure. So we have seen that reflected in the data as well.
Thank you.
It's certainly been an area which has generated a lot of interest, actually, but the unoccupied dwellings in the census. And it is a really tricky one for us to provide information on in the census because the homes are unoccupied, we generally don't have a census form or any kind of census response from those households. So it is an area, I think, as is an increasing interest in. It's something that we need to think about out as a nation. Like, do we need to understand more about our unoccupied homes as well as our occupied homes? Certainly those figures that Caroline was talking about, I've got them in front of me here. The proportion of unoccupied homes in Canberra has gone down from 8.1% in 2016 to 6.6% in 2021. And the actual number of homes unoccupied has dropped by 600, despite there being a significant dwelling growth in the ACT.
Thanks, Duncan. Next question. Are the trends that we are seeing in the long-term health conditions in the ACT similar to the rest of Australia?
Might start here, but Caroline, and you might want to jump in as well. So I highlighted, as we were talking through the slides, some of the differences we saw in that. So one which sort of stood out to me was to asthma being higher reported in the ACT versus the rest of the country, so 9% versus 8.1%. We've already touched on mental health conditions, 10% compared to 8.8%, but also lower reporting for diabetes and heart disease. But so there are some differences, and particularly like with the ACT, when you're looking at quite a large population, to have a percentage point difference to the rest of the country, that's quite significant. Again, some of this is potentially explained by age. Like if you have a slightly different age profile, you'd expect to see some slightly different health conditions. But yeah, this is certainly an area, I think we're only just scraping the surface of analysis on the health conditions question in the census at this stage.
Thanks, Duncan. Is Australia an ageing population, and how does that affect our future planning? Will we need more aged care and disability workers? And does the birth rate need to increase?
Again, a a great question and a really interesting question. The median age we saw in the census was the same from 2016 to 2021 at 38, but it has it increased in 2016 from 37 and increased from 2006 when it was 35. So we are seeing a slow, gradual increase in the median age. But the changing age profile of a population isn't just influenced by births and deaths in a population and by mortality. It's also influenced by international migration. And so as people migrate into the country, they tend to be now at lower than the median age of a population. So they have a downwards kind of pressure. In terms of, but overall, yes, particularly if you look back a long time, we're a much older country than we were 50 years ago. And it would be reasonable to expect that to continue. The census data provides such a fascinating picture of what that might mean for the country, because it does we haven't focused today on the questions around need for assistance, and the census asks questions about people's need for assistance, and we see that does significantly increase with age. A number of the long-term health conditions significantly increase with age, and so they would be suggestive of the fact that there are service considerations for us. Some of the other fascinating things you can get from a census is also looking then at the different languages spoken at different ages, and what we see is that quite a higher proportion of older Australians who don't have English language skills as strongly. So often surviving women in a couple will have at lower English language skills, and then that intersects with our sort of service delivery and service planning.
I might add a little bit to that, Aoife, because I saw the second part of that question was talking about the need for different types of workers, for aged and disability care workers. And we haven't been able to talk about occupation today because that data comes out in second release. But what we will be able to see when the data comes out in second release is how much has that change. Have we got more aged and disability care workers in Australia in 2021? And I've quickly looked up the number, and in 2016 we had 135,000 aged and disability care workers, and in a few months' time we'll be able to tell you how many we have got for last year's results.
Thank you, Caroline. This question may be for both of you. What surprised you the most about the findings for the ACT?
I might jump in first so that Caroline doesn't steal mine, but it really was one of the ones that Caroline pointed out was the growth in the Nepalese community in the ACT. So it has grown, I'm not sure, not quite 1,000%, but somewhere towards that kind of level. And so seeing just how significant a very small community can grow and establish over that 5-year period of time, and then as it feeds through the data in terms of languages, in terms of country of birth of parents, that was probably the one which stood out for me with the ACT.
And what I found quite interesting is the way we've seen the growth in particular suburbs or particular areas in the ACT. And I guess what you can see in a population that's smaller compared to, say, New South Wales or Victoria, that really planned population growth and really deliberate planning of new suburbs. And so we've seen in Molonglo was the example in the last few years, and also then the continued growth of Gungahlin over a little bit longer than that. And I reported there on the mortgage situation of people in Molonglo. But the other thing that was interesting was just the number of families. So I think what you see when you play with the ACT data is the result of, town planning in action. And it's really, really clear on some of that data we've presented today.
Thank you, Caroline and Duncan. The next question looks ahead to the future censuses. So what would be the approach for the next census for those who identify as LGBTQI+, as non-binary may not cover all?
I can probably take that one because I did talk about, we asked a question on sex, and that question on sex had one response, an additional response option being non-binary sex. And I did emphasize that we're not asking about gender identity there. We're asking very much about sex, and the sex question is what we've been asking on the census as long as we've been running them. But as we were preparing for the 2021 census, we ran a consultation process to see what questions should be added to the census, what data needs were out there, and what questions should we add to the census. And we did have a lot of interest in some measures of sort of LGBTI populations, in particular adding questions around gender identity and sexual orientation. And as we've presented today, we're able to add questions on health and service with the Australian Defence Force, but we didn't see the questions added around sexual orientation or gender identity. So I expect that as we head towards the next census in 2026, we'll also be running that review process of questions that are on the census form. And I know we continue to be in conversations with data users and advocates in the LGBTIQ space. I know they will be pushing again to have questions on gender identity and sexual orientation added to the census. But it probably is worth pointing out that we do collect data on those populations in surveys that the ABS runs. And in particular, we released last Friday, there is the first results from our mental health survey, and there's some information in there about gender identity and how that related to people who reported various mental health conditions.
Thank you, Caroline. What other data seminars will you be running to explain the census data in more detail?
I can probably take that one again. So we are running these seminars for all jurisdictions, and we ran a national seminar. If you missed it, earlier this month, we ran a national seminar where we looked at the Australia level data. If you want to catch that up, that is available on the ABS website. And then we're running these seminars with insights into each state and territory. Beyond that, we've also already ran an Indigenous data seminar a couple of weeks ago, so you'll find that on the website. As we look forward over the next couple of months, we will be preparing a seminar and delivering a seminar on health conditions. Duncan gave a picture of that today, but we'll be diving into that in more detail later this month, later August. And then the other one that I was talking about today is measures of cultural diversity, and we'll be doing a seminar on various aspects of cultural diversity and really having a deep dive into that. Then we get towards second release data, and come October, I expect we're going to do this all again. And the other thing we're going to do after our second release data is a seminar all about a service with the Australian Defence Force. So we presented some of the data to you today on service with the ADF, but we'll be adding to that as we get other measures from the next release of data in October, and we'll be doing a seminar probably in about November, I think, on service with the ADF. So still a lot more to come, and as we continue to deliver these, they'll all be available on the ABS website. So yeah, you can always find them there.
Thanks, Caroline. I might add just one little piece to that as well, if I can. So I'm conscious that a number of you will be joining us from other federal agencies across Canberra today. Just highlighting that the ABS does have a network of outposted officers across our agencies in Canberra, and they're available and keen to help. But if you're not in a situation with an outposted officer, or not sure if you do or not, as Aoife pointed out, if you reach out through the client services channel of the ABS, it's not just our job to collect the data on Australia, it's our job to help try and make sure that data's available and used to inform Australia's important decisions. And so really keen to help out wherever we can.
Thanks, Duncan. And our last question for today is to you both. What's your favourite story from the 2021 census data?
I might go first this time. So I think I'm not going to tell a local story, but a story that we identified as we're analysing the data nationally. And it's one that's got a little bit of media attention in recent times, and that's the Yazidi population. So the Yazidi is a ancestry or an ethnicity of people who are coming from northern Iraq. And what we've shown, that's the fastest growing ancestry in all of Australia in the last 5 years. And I forget the number, but it was something like over 1,000% increase in the number of people identifying as Yazidi. And those people are clustered in two main areas, in Toowoomba and in Wagga. And just last week, I saw a story in the media about refugee advocates in Toowoomba reaching out, pointing to the census data, showing that there's been such an increase of the people with that Yazidi background in Toowoomba and calling for support. So I thought that was seeing our data in action. When we were playing in the spreadsheets, we saw that, and it got picked up in the media, and the refugee advocates in Toowoomba have been using that data to call for support. So that's my one. Duncan, I don't know what was your favourite story?
I think I'd go to the really broad picture. The ABS was a bit nervous leading up to a 2021 census. We've seen some censuses around the world have declining response rates. We're facing a census at a completely unique time in Australia's history, and to see the way that Australians participated in the census, and particularly to see people in ACT participate, over 97% response rate to the census. I think that just speaks volumes to people's willingness to make a contribution to Australia's information and have that data available. And so I'll probably finish on that kind of broad kind of message and say thank you to everyone for completing their censuses. We'll be back with another census form in just over 4 years, but hopefully we engage with you a lot in between using the census data from last year.
Thanks, Duncan. And thanks everyone for all the questions that you posted today on Poll EV. As Caroline said earlier, if you'd like to tune into a future census data seminar, you can do so on the ABS website through the Eventbrite links, and there'll be topic-based seminars coming also in late August and after second data release. And if you have any further questions, feel free to email us at client.services@abs.gov.au. Thank you very much for joining us today. A recording of today's presentation will be made available on the ABS YouTube channel and the ABS website in the coming days. Many thanks. Bye now.